Covering topics like business, finance, and economics every week can sometimes feel a bit bleak. Over the past 2 years, personal savings have dwindled, consumer debt has soared to unprecedented levels, and the job market has been marred by trends that disadvantage workers, such as ghost jobs, widespread layoffs, and the rise of gig work. Meanwhile, asset prices have surged far beyond what most households can afford, outpacing both income growth and fundamental valuations. The consequences are clear. For those who rely on wages to make a living, keeping up with individuals who already hold assets is becoming increasingly difficult. Even the most dedicated and career-driven people are finding it challenging to cover their expenses, let alone save and invest for future financial stability. If this all feels overwhelming, remember, things could always be worse. You could be living in Canada. As students return to schools across the country, many are still struggling to secure jobs. A common global issue today is the disconnect between headline economic figures like GDP growth, stock market performance, and unemployment rates, which often seem strong, and the realities faced by individuals whose wages have lagged behind productivity, who don't own stocks, and who juggle multiple new jobs yet still struggle to pay their bills. In Canada, however, even the headline numbers are falling short. GDP growth has been lackluster, and due to rapid population increases driven by high immigration rates, GDP per capita has shown little improvement over the past decade. Unemployment rates are higher compared to the US, and the average annual wage is significantly lower. But there is one area where Canada surpasses the United States: the cost of housing. The average Canadian earns less, but faces much higher home prices, exacerbating one of the world's most pressing issues. Canada has become known for exporting natural resources, manufactured goods, and YouTube content lamenting its housing market crisis. While this might seem redundant to discuss, it's crucial because a bigger issue is often overlooked. Surprisingly, the US also faces a severe housing affordability crisis, as does much of the developed world. However, Canada's situation stands out. Comparing global real estate prices is complicated. For instance, cities like Tokyo might have higher costs per square foot than San Francisco. Yet Tokyo provides a greater range of smaller, budget-friendly apartments for ordinary residents. This distinction is why Tokyo, despite its high costs, is often lauded for housing affordability. In contrast, the sprawling nature of US cities means homes might be pricier, but they also tend to offer more space. If you can manage to buy a home, it's likely to be more spacious than an equivalently priced property in a densely populated city. Take Vancouver and Seattle, for example. These cities share similar populations, cultural tendencies for single-family homes, centered around business districts, and geographic proximity. The average home in Vancouver is slightly more expensive than in Seattle, yet Seattle's median household income is over twice as high, thanks to major tech giants like Microsoft and Amazon, which are headquartered there, alongside numerous other tech firms and supporting industries. These companies employ a large number of people in well-paying positions, which has driven up real estate prices in cities like San Francisco, New York, and Seattle. Having personally moved to one of these cities for a similar job, I understand firsthand the challenges this creates for locals who can no longer afford to live in their own neighborhoods. However, there is a certain logic to it. People with high-paying jobs can manage higher rents, and since these lucrative roles are concentrated in just a handful of cities, those places become incredibly expensive. In the US, real estate prices have been inflated due to a few major industries. In Canada, however, real estate itself is the industry. A report from the OECD highlighted that real estate accounts for 40% of Canada's capital investment, while in the US, that figure is only 20%. Ironically, Canada's largest real estate agency proudly shared this statistic in a post they made around this time last year. Vancouver, unlike Seattle, doesn't offer the same job opportunities where young professionals can earn life-changing salaries before turning 30 and then relocate. Vancouver is essentially a typical city for ordinary people, with job prospects that are relatively unremarkable. To put it differently, people don't move to Vancouver to advance their financial goals the way they do in Seattle. Census data confirms this too. The average resident of Vancouver is 4 years older than the average resident of Seattle. This exacerbates existing problems because, in cities like these, financial stability isn't primarily determined by income or responsible financial habits. Instead, it largely comes down to whether or not you own property. A highly skilled professional who saves diligently and invests wisely will still be at a financial disadvantage compared to someone with an average income and poor money habits, simply because rent is so high, and property ownership generates more wealth than the people living in those properties. Canada's housing market is undoubtedly problematic, but many people stop the discussion there. However, here's a bold perspective. Expensive housing isn't necessarily an issue if wages rise alongside prices. Homes in West Virginia seem cheap to Californians, but would still be costly for someone from Bangladesh due to the differences in average incomes. So while it's easy and entertaining to scroll through Canadian real estate listings and react in disbelief at rundown homes priced far beyond what we'll ever earn, it's important to look deeper into the issue. What's crucial to understand about Canada's housing crisis is how it deteriorated so badly without household incomes keeping pace, and what the long-term consequences might be. Even for homeowners, this situation isn't ideal. So let's break down how money works and figure out what exactly is going on in America's hat. Now, if economic opportunity isn't the reason Canada's real estate prices are so inflated, what is? There are actually 3 key factors at play here. My friend Richard from Shaw the Plain Bagel did an excellent deep dive on this issue last year. As a Canadian financial expert, his insights are worth checking out if you want a deeper analysis. The first factor is Canada's surprising population concentration. Although it's the second largest country in the world, most Canadians live near the southern border in a small number of cities. These cities are typically surrounded by protected natural areas, making them attractive places to live. However, combined with strict zoning laws, this limits the land available for new housing development. On top of that, Canadians seem even more resistant to medium-density housing than Americans. The second factor is that Canada didn't experience the 2008 housing market crash like the US did. Their financial system wasn't as over-leveraged, and resource exports to China provided economic support. As American real estate went through a significant correction, Canadian property values barely dipped, and any losses were recovered within months. Consequently, home prices remained high, and investors didn't lose confidence like they did in the US, where many lost everything and became cautious about real estate investments. The third factor is immigration. Canada accepts roughly 1/5 the number of immigrants each year compared to the United States, despite the US having 8 times the population and a greater number of cities to accommodate people. Even some of the most pro-immigration advocates in the US are acknowledging that challenges exist, and in Canada, migration patterns differ in notable ways. A larger proportion of newcomers to Canada are already relatively affluent and enter through skilled worker or student visa programs. For many, job prospects in Canada are less important than the country's political stability, safety, and strong property rights. Owning property in Canada is viewed as a secure way to safeguard wealth, particularly for those coming from countries where governments might seize assets without warning. This has given rise to a practice known as land banking, where a family member with a visa, often a student residency, purchases property purely to store wealth safely. The Canadian government has tried to address this by introducing taxes on vacant properties, but the practice persists, with some finding ways to bypass these taxes. Additionally, Canada offers a smoother path to skilled worker visas compared to the US. While salaries in Canada may not match those in the US, they are significantly higher than wages for similar roles in developing nations. This immigration policy helps offset Canada's aging population and fills skill shortages that Canadian residents are underpaid to address. For investors, this immigration trend reinforces the belief that real estate remains a solid investment, as the government must continue attracting people to sustain the economy. However, this only explains part of the issue. It also connects to another significant challenge. Canadians favor investing in housing to such an extent that they often overlook other investment opportunities. When they do invest in businesses, US companies tend to be more appealing than Canadian ones. In fact, the combined market value of Canada's largest publicly listed companies is smaller than that of Apple, Microsoft, or Nvidia alone. This disparity is why Canadian companies can't offer salaries comparable to major American firms, leading much of Canada's top talent to seek higher-paying jobs in the US. If given the choice between living in Toronto, where home prices are 4 times higher than in Houston, and earning more money in Texas, which option would you pick? Seriously, if you're Canadian, leave a comment below. Let's see what the consensus is. Every year, hundreds of thousands of young Canadians are choosing to leave the country, increasing Canada's reliance on immigration to avoid economic collapse. Beyond challenges with attracting investment, starting a business in Canada is more difficult due to stricter regulations, a smaller local market, a limited talent pool, and high costs for commercial real estate. Canada demonstrates how a housing crisis can turn into a broader economic crisis, and by the time people fully realize this, it may already be too late. Trying to deflate this precarious housing market without triggering a collapse in household debt could take decades. Many Canadians are already feeling the strain since most mortgages there are variable rate. As interest rates have risen to combat inflation, mortgage payments have significantly increased, even for those who initially secured loans when rates were low. In the past 4 years, some mortgage payments have doubled or tripled, leaving families with little room in their budgets for anything beyond housing costs. So while Canada's situation might make you feel slightly better, don't get too confident. The US isn't far behind, and American lending standards are not as strict as those in Canada. While Canada is propping up its housing market through high levels of immigration, the US relies on risky practices like 1% down payment mortgages and corporate investments in real estate. Although average incomes in the US are higher, they are skewed by a small number of extremely high earners working in industries that have turned cities like Seattle and San Francisco into unaffordable, gentrified nightmares. In Canada, the income floor for those hit hardest by unaffordable housing is higher, assuming they can find employment. If you're Canadian and this video has left you feeling down, just remember things could be worse. You could be living in Australia. Don't forget to subscribe if you want us to break down that mess in a future video.